Hello and welcome to the 8th video in the not so mini video series on Linux Essentials. In this video series I'm running through the top things I believe you should really know when using the Linux CLI, focusing on just core essential knowledge that will get you by as a daily Linux user. In this video, we'll be looking at how to download files from the internet super quickly and easily using the Linux CLI. We'll take a look at the very popular curl and wget utilities as part of this video. These two utilities are incredibly valuable, and when you've got them in your arsenal, no remote file is ever looked at the same way. You'll be able to download them straight away at the CLI with ease. Okay, great, that's what's on the menu then. Let's head over to my desktop and get started. But as always, before I do, I would just like to raise to your attention my Patreon account. In case you're interested in accessing videos that aren't on YouTube, would like one-to-one support with my videos if you have any issues, or if you would just like to support my work because you find it useful, that would be very much appreciated. Okay. So here we are on my desktop, ready to go in my bash terminal in my user.py's home directory. Often people transition from the world of downloading files using a user interface to using the CLI at some point in their Linux CLI journey. I'm going to reach a little here and say that downloading files may be something that you've done frequently using something like a web interface or a FTP client perhaps, such as FileZilla. But you can actually obtain files very easily at the CLI without these graphical aids, and it's very important to know how to do that, as it'll save you an awful lot of time. So I mentioned I'm going to cover two tools, wget and curl. They are both basically the same in terms of what they are used for, although they do have differences. But despite this, being a Linux Essentials course, I couldn't help but cover both, despite the overlap, as they're both so popular and there is some differences, so it's worth knowing both of them. Before we get into curl and wget though, let's talk about how files are generally made available for transfer, as in how do you know they're available and where do they come from in a sense. There are a large number of approaches for how files and folders can be made available to other machines remotely. It actually isn't the default position, which doesn't come as a surprise. For files and folders to be shared, they're always private by definition. Files and folders have to be served by something to make them available to the outside world. For example, HTTP servers can host files from a given directory. This makes sense because they host the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and other files that are required for websites. But a website, in fact, is nothing more than a series of files, and therefore it is unsurprising that a HTTP protocol can be used to deliver any kind of file or folder through that mechanism just by providing the URL. So it doesn't have to be a website. In fact, often a RESTful API is basically a HTTP endpoint pointing at data. Sometimes data from a database and sometimes simply data from files. So suffice to say, HTTP as a protocol is a very common mechanism to disseminate files around the internet. But we do require the server on which the files exist to be running a HTTP server to make them available. Additionally, we have FTP and SFTP, which are also protocols, the same as HTTP. And they are protocols for sharing files over a network. Again, you have to have a FTP server running to deliver files. You can't connect and retrieve files from a server if that server isn't running an FTP server. So we're not going to cover everything, as this is an essentials course, just the top things that I think are very common and you will likely come across. And these are undeniably HTTP and FTP, with their encrypted counterparts HTTPS and SFTP. Also sometimes FTPS. And actually SFTP and FTPS are different protocols, but they do the exact same thing. So enough talk. Let's first start then with curl and discuss how to use it to obtain files through HTTP and HTTPS. So curl stands for client URL, and it's a very standard way of transferring files between machines at the command line. It's super lightweight, so it's often used in embedded systems for file transfers, and it's also very, very old. It's been around for a very long time. Let's make sure it's installed before we get going. It most likely will be. It comes with most distributions as standard, but to make sure, do the following: sudo apt-get install curl and press enter. A very standard command I'm sure you have been using a lot. So as you can see, I already have it, and I expect you already will as well, but just in case, run that command. To use it in its most basic form, the syntax is as follows: curl followed by the URL. And in fact, that URL could be a HTTP URL, or it could be a FTP URL. This is actually what we're going to see is all that we need to distinguish between those entirely different services from the point of view of curl. This example we're going to cover, the first set of examples, are going to be what are basically HTTP GET requests to a HTTP server. So if you know a file is available via a URL, for example, then by literally doing what I'm showing above, you can retrieve it using curl. It's that simple. For fun, to show how easy it is, let's demonstrate this by retrieving the content of Google's homepage, similarly to how a browser would do it. So I'm just going to replace the URL with https://www.google.com. So I'm going to retrieve the file at this address. Okay, so what we've retrieved here is the content of the Google homepage by performing a simple HTTP GET request on that address, and it's providing us the data contained in the index page of google.com. It's basically HTML code with some additional bits and pieces. If we then decide we want to save that information, we can do so by redirecting the output from the console, which is what we're seeing here, which is the terminal, instead into a file using the arrow operator as follows. So I'll just clear my screen to stay organized, and I'll say curl https://www.google.com, and then I'm going to redirect the output using the redirect operator, which is a forward arrow or right arrow, and I'm going to go to say, I don't know, let's call it index.html. There we go. So I've now retrieved that file. Now let's take a look inside that file using the concatenate utility that we've seen in a previous video, just to check that what is inside is indeed what we saw previously. So cat index, use the tab to complete the line, press enter, and there we go. It is exactly the same thing. Okay, so again, I'm going to clear my screen. I'm just going to delete that file because I no longer need it. Okay, so that's just for fun, to show what curl can do just to get us going. I've shown how you can obtain the HTML from a website using a HTTP request via curl, but what about a text file, for example? I'm sure that's more likely what you're thinking about when you think about getting files from the internet. Well, this is basically, in fact, the exact same thing as what we've just done. But let's find one that is what is obviously a text file and retrieve it. I'm going to do that by downloading a file from a public GitHub repository just to demonstrate. Now I'm going to copy this from my notes as opposed to typing it in because the URL doesn't really matter. As long as there's a file there, it doesn't really matter. So you can see the syntax is exactly the same. Now, incidentally, this is a typical URL for getting the raw files from GitHub, but it is nonetheless just a URL to a particular resource, in this case a text file. You can get the path from GitHub, if you're interested, by pressing the raw button, that's R-A-W, when you're looking at a GitHub repository, just in case you're interested in seeing the actual source content. The point is, what we're seeing here is a Python requirements file, which I'm going to now retrieve. So if I press enter, There we go. Now, unlike before, I've not redirected it, so we can just see the output of requirements.txt on my screen. So a requirements file is basically a Python file that tells Python what the dependencies are on the application. So, which is pretty cool. I mean, that's been taken from the internet at this address. Similarly, as we've seen before, to save this actual file to a file on our system, I'm going to use the up key to get the same command back, and I'm going to use the redirect operator, and I'm just going to call it requirements.txt. Oops, like that. There we go. And then I can cat it to confirm that this has worked, and indeed I now have the requirements file on my computer. And there we go, so we do. I'm going to clear my screen. I'm going to delete the requirements text file because I no longer need it, just to stay organized. Okay. Okay, now alternatively, instead of using the redirect operator, which we've used here, to save the file to a file in this way, there is another way of doing it with curl, and it's worth knowing. So instead of doing this, what we can do instead is I'm going to go back to the, actually I don't need to go back to the start. To keep it consistent, what I'll do is I'll do it at the end. I'm going to add an option -o for output, and I'm going to then put the name of the output here. So as you can see, it's very similar. If I press enter, the same thing will happen. So you can see the syntax is very similar to this. We're just doing it slightly differently. Now the redirect operator, the arrow, has nothing to do with curl at all. It's a shell construct that allows us to redirect the standard output. Whereas the -o flag or option is actually part of curl and will write it to file itself. Both ways will work. So let's just delete requirements again. Requirements, okay. Clear my screen, stay organized. Okay, so both are common patterns to obtain a file served by a HTTP server. I can use either of those approaches, either the arrow or the -o option. Now before we move on then, let's do the same thing as we've just done with curl, but using wget, to compare the two. Now bear with me here, if you're wondering why I'm showing both. It is because there are, as I've mentioned, differences between the two systems. wget can do some things better than curl, and curl can do some things better. In fact, can do some things that wget can't. So it's really good to know both of them. Before we get going though, let's make sure it's installed, similarly to how we did with curl. So sudo apt-get install, seen all this before, wget. Obviously I have it installed, so it'll be there available very quickly. I expect it will be installed on your system as well. Now, let's use it similarly to how we did with curl in order to compare the two. The only difference will be that wget will download a file automatically. We don't have to tell it where to put the results with a -o flag, for example, or indeed a redirection operator, as we'll see. So I'm just going to copy and paste here the command, but it's exactly the same as what we've done before. In fact, I could have just pressed the up arrow and replaced curl for wget. You'll see that here is the wget command, and here is the URL. It is exactly the same syntax, so there's not really much more to remember. If I press enter, there we go, it's downloaded it. So let's just have a quick look inside, just to check again that it's there. Just do cat requirements text, there we go, and it is. So you'll see the difference is that we've not had to provide it with an output file. It's actually gone and got it as if it was the file that we're retrieving. And under the hood, it's very likely doing exactly the same thing, retrieving the stream of data and then putting it into a file with the same name. So let's delete that. So there you go, that's how you retrieve a file from wget. And it's exactly the same syntax, interestingly. Excuse me. Now, if we wished, we could be explicit as to the output name, just in case we want to name it something different. So I'll just go back to the last command here. I'll just go back to the that's funny, excuse me a minute. Last command, wget, there we go, and I will use a -o option, and then I will name it something like requirements.txt, but I'll use a different name just to confirm it works. There we go. And now if I cat it, I will find that it's there, but the name of the file is different. Okay. Now notice that this is different to curl at this point, as in this case we have had to use a capital O, which is a bit annoying that we have to remember that distinction from curl, which uses lowercase o for this functionality, but I'm afraid you do if you want to be able to use both systems. But there aren't many of these things to consider and remember. Now that we've dealt with a file then, you may be wondering what happens if we use wget on a website URL, similarly to what we first did with curl. With curl, we got the HTML displayed on standard out, so it displayed it in the terminal, which we had to redirect to an actual file using either the -o option or the redirect operator. Now with wget, we're going to see that we just get the index.html file straight away, which is in my opinion more convenient, and it does make wget a little bit more attractive as a mechanism for getting data over HTTP. So let's give that a go. wget. In fact, as this is an essentials course, let me remind you a feature that we can use. I'm going to press Ctrl+R to search for my history, and I'm going to type in wget followed by https:// and hopefully as soon as I press W, Google will appear, which it does. So it's remembered that command from previously. I'm going to press enter and it's going to run it for me. So what we've got here is, incidentally, you won't have that in your history. I have it in my history because I've done this before, I should mention. You probably won't have wget with Google, but I just wanted to remind you that you could do that. But this is the command you would like to run if you want to go ahead and copy along, and it'll download, as you can see here, the index.html file. So if I cat it, we should see, there we go, the Google homepage. So we can see that it contains the same content as it did previously. So in a way, wget is just a tad bit simpler for using as a means of performing HTTP GET requests. And for this reason, amongst others, I do prefer it. So let's just clear up a minute, rm index.html and clear. Another thing which makes wget more attractive as an offering for obtaining files from the internet is that it can download entire directories with ease, whereas curl can't without a bit of scripting, so it's something worth bearing in mind. For individual files, curl and wget work almost exactly the same way, and they work equally well, but for a directory, wget is really your best option. So just to show you the syntax for this, I won't actually download anything, but I'll just show you the syntax. It looks like this: wget, no parent, -r, followed by the URL, like we had before, followed by the directory you wish to download. So that's the syntax. Let's now have a little play with it. Let's do it for the Google homepage, just for a bit of fun. So I'll just go backwards here, and I'll now do https://www.google.com. Now, a URL to a website like this is basically just an address to a folder, nothing else. But it happens to be a root folder for the content of the website. So when I press enter, it's going to try and download the whole root of Google's homepage. I should mention that the no parent option basically means don't ascend into the parent directory. Now, in this case, we didn't need it. But it's just useful to have. It means that you only want to download the directory that you're pointing to in the URL, and it's a fairly standard option to include. In this case, it wasn't required, but it's worth doing. The -r stands for recursive, and it basically will it'll mean that we recursively obtain files. It's actually the -r which is the option which makes downloading a directory possible. Okay, let's now take a look inside the directory that I've downloaded. So I will have downloaded the directory called www.google.com. So let's have a look inside here. I'm going to use some flags for my ls command. I always use ALH. And there we go. I've downloaded all of that from the Google server. So hopefully that's quite exciting to see how easy it is to do that. I'm just going to delete it because I don't want it anymore. Okay. So there's so much more to cover here in terms of options and capability for downloading files in this way, i.e. via HTTP, but I don't wish to go into too many details to avoid the video becoming too long. I recommend having a search on Google if you want to find out more on this subject. I've covered just the essentials and most common use cases of curl and wget for you so far. The next thing to talk about is the issue of authentication. Sometimes you'll require authentication to use wget and curl with a HTTP request. There are many types of authentication, so I can't cover them all here, particularly on an essentials course like this. But I want to raise to your attention that doing what we've been doing is all well and good, so long as we do it on public files. But you must bear in mind that sometimes you will need to authenticate. So let's briefly talk about authentication, which the most simple type of which is basic authentication, or basic auth for short. Basic auth isn't used as much as it used to be, but it's certainly still worth knowing about. So sometimes a HTTP service will be protected using basic auth, which means you need to pass a username and password. And so you will have to do that through wget and curl if you want to get access to that resource. Well, unsurprisingly, you can pass the username and password for basic auth to wget and curl, and you can do it as follows. I'll show examples of both syntax for wget and curl as follows. I shall do this in a text file so that it's you can see clearly, so call it temp. So I'll paste it in, and now I'll paste the curl one in. Useful to see the difference between them. Okay, you'll see basically, if we just break this down, it's very simple. Ignoring all of this just for a minute, you'll see that it is exactly the same command. It's wget followed by a URL, and the same with curl. If you ignore all of that, it's just curl followed by the URL. In between, we're just going to pass some information, in this case username and password. For curl, it's providing it as username : password. And I can see why it's doing that. That's because in the URL, this is actually how it looks when it's provided as a basic auth. It's concatenated to the URL in this format. So you just provide it like that. You put your username and password in. For wget, it's user with 2 minuses and password with 2 minuses, followed by the username and the password. So you can see the syntax differences here, but they both perform the exact same operation. I want to be clear, however, is that I have shown basic auth really as a demonstration. There are, as mentioned, other forms of authentication, which you can Google if you come up against a brick wall when using wget or curl, and the URL requires authentication. Okay, get out of there. Next then, and lastly with respect to HTTP services, let's talk about APIs. And this is where curl will come into its own, as wget can't do this. So repeat, wget cannot query easily APIs. This is very much the domain of curl. So what we've basically been doing here so far is performing a HTTP GET request to get a file or content of a file from a HTTP server. HTTP endpoints, though, can offer the ability to pass query parameters along with the GET request, which allows us to customize the response we get back. Now, curl offers this ability in one of two ways. We can provide a URL, which contains the query parameters embedded into it, or we can provide the query parameters as separate options. So without going into a course on how URLs are structured, I can tell you that query parameters are embedded in the URL as separated by ampersands, and we can provide as many as we like. So, first off then, I'll show an example of performing a request against an API in the form of a HTTP GET request to a HTTP service using curl. So let's have a look. Just going to copy and paste it in. So that's the command I'm going to run. I've encapsulated this in quotes, you can see. Now you don't have to, but I consider it to be good practice in case you have any characters, particularly ampersands, if you have more than one query parameter, which will confuse the command. So I tend to do this as a standard thing. So let's have a look at this. So what we've got here is a URL followed by a /find. So that there is the URL to the API. The question mark indicates that there's going to be some additional data coming along in the in the request. And here is the query parameter. The query parameter key is title and the value is energy. So what I'm asking is, I would like you to find, because this is a find endpoint, I would like to find a entry in your database where title equals energy. Now you could have additional query parameters, and if we did, I'd just have an ampersand and I'd do it again. I'd then have another key equals val, and so on, so forth. Okay, I'll press enter here to run this. So there we go. We've got a JSON response in this case. The type of data coming back depends on the API and what they're giving to you. Sometimes you can provide a query parameter which actually specifies what kind of format you want the data back in. Sometimes you have no choice. Finally, for completion, we can use curl using options instead of embedding the query parameters in the URL. And I think, generally speaking, people prefer this because it's neater. So let's show that. I'll just press up on the keyboard to go back to our API call using curl. And I'm going to delete our query parameters there, leaving just find behind. And I'm going to add a -d option, followed by, in single quotes, title equals energy, for example, if that's what I wanted to search for. I press enter and we get the exact same output. It's attempted to retrieve something looking for a title of energy. Okay, if you wanted to add more, by the way, if you wanted to add more query parameters, if the API supported lots of other things, you just do -d again, followed by more content. So this is great. Hopefully this is going to open doors for you. You can now query APIs, open APIs at the moment, through the command line, which is fantastic. It's worth me mentioning at this point, actually, that there are many other types of HTTP methods. There's get, post, delete, put, for example, but we won't cover them here. This video is all about getting files, not how to interact, really, with APIs. And this is a HTTP GET request that you're seeing here. I should point out as well that curl will support different types, but I'll leave that for you to do some Googling. So, why doesn't wget allow for this, you might be wondering? Well, basically, wget is designed to retrieve files rather than data. So wget just isn't the tool for the job in this instance, hence why we must be aware of both tools. wget is a superior tool, in my opinion, for retrieving files and folders from FTP and SFTP services, which we'll cover in just a minute, and indeed HTTP servers. But curl is definitely the tool of choice for API requests, for certain. And of course, it is still useful for quickly downloading individual files from HTTP and FTP servers as well. So basically knowing both is very important, which is why I'm covering them both here. Right, we've only skimmed the surface, but that's okay for an essentials course. You now know how to retrieve files from HTTP servers, either via wget or curl, how to obtain whole directories with wget, and how to access API data using curl, either by using query parameters in the URL or using the options approach. We've also looked at how we can provide basic authentication for curl and wget, so you're well equipped already. Now, before I wrap up retrieving data from HTTP servers, I think it's worth bearing in mind that the majority of APIs will require a key to access the content. Typically, authentication is passed through as part of the request header, which again is beyond the scope of this course to talk about. But just to include it whilst we're here, I think I will show how to add a key, because you may hit a wall quite quickly if you're trialing this. So suffice to say, you'll have to get the key, and there are different ways of doing that, and it depends on the service how you get the key. But assuming you do have an API key, the syntax to include an API key, roughly speaking, depending on the service, will look as follows in curl. I'll just copy and paste the command in for you, just to give you an idea. So at the bottom here you can see it. So nothing new to look at here. This is just curl and a URL. We've seen that before. -d is an option, just to show that you can include that with a key value pair. This is a query parameter. But then this bit is the new bit. --header says that we're going to add a header key value. Then we've got the key and the value. Excuse the term key there, where the key is whatever name the API is expecting to refer to the API key. So the API will be expecting a particular name. It could be something like authorization or auth key or API-key. The API documentation will tell you what it is. And then this is the actual key that you're going to include here. So that's the syntax, and that will hopefully help you if you're connecting to an API that requires a key. Just bear in mind, as I say, the key has to often be put in the header, not as a query parameter. Okay, so that's it for HTTP services and using wget and curl to retrieve data and files. Let's now move on to the second part, which is thankfully a lot shorter than the first, because most of the syntax we'll need we've already covered. And from the point of view of us as users, FTP and SFTP with curl and wget is just a different protocol with the same tool, so it looks exactly the same. So FTP and SFTP are just protocols for transferring data over a network connection. To retrieve files from a server, however, using FTP or SFTP, the server must be running an FTP or SFTP server. And you must have available to you an FTP or SFTP client to connect to the FTP or SFTP server. Well, of course, you do have a client. Curl and wget are FTP clients, so that's fine. So now we just need to assume there is an FTP server running somewhere that allows us to connect to it. And this is how you do it with both tools. So with curl, we do the following. Assuming you're connecting to a known FTP server, the syntax looks like this. I'll just clear my screen to keep organized. Okay, now the interesting thing about this is that actually I'll delete the first part. Let's just have a look at it like this. You can see how, and this is a valid command by the way, I deleted the option and it's completely valid to do that. This is how you make an FTP request using curl. You can see how it is exactly the same syntax, exactly the same as the HTTP request. The only difference is this bit here says FTP instead of HTTP. Now, what we did have as well was a --FTP -SSL option. And what that meant is it's telling curl we're going to be using SFTP, which is the secure version, instead of plain FTP. Okay, so we can extend this command in a couple of ways. So we're going to talk about now what else we can do here. And it's important we do so because connecting to an FTP server like this makes the big assumption that the FTP server is fully open without the need for password or username, and that's highly unlikely. So let's extend the command by including a username and password, which is a very common procedure for FTP servers. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to open up a nano text editor so that I can show you the difference between these. So I'm going to start with this one we've just seen, which is just curl and then an FTP URL. Okay, now the next one, which includes a username and password, is here. So the difference only is that we've got a -u option followed by a username and password. So you just put your username here and your password here and it will connect using this approach. Okay, so that's fine, that's nice and easy, not much more to remember there. And finally, the main way you should be connecting to most services actually is using public private key authentication via SSL, and that requires you to supply a private key. Now I won't go into how and why public-private key authentication works. It's far beyond this course, and it's not the focus of this video. But if you do need to provide a private key, and you have one, this is how you provide it to curl. So you'll see it's exactly the same up to here. We just add an additional -- key followed by the key file. The path here is a very common one, by the way. SSH keys are often located in the hidden .ssh folder, and this is a common name for a key. And then this is just the FTP URL. So you can see how simple it is. So with curl, you can see the syntax is exactly the same to retrieve files from an FTP or SFTP server, as it is if you were retrieving it from a HTTP one. This makes remembering what I've just shown you much, much easier. So let's complete the set by looking at wget. So let's have a look at wget here. So that's wget. So again, notice for wget, it is exactly the same. We just reference the FTP instead of HTTP for the protocol. And as with curl, we can add a username and password. So let's have a look at that. There we go. So again, you can see we've just added this chunk here in the middle, but otherwise it's exactly the same, wget followed by URL. We've just added FTP username and FTP password into the mix. And finally, we can add in a private key, the all-important private key. So I'll just show you what that looks like. But again, you won't be surprised that it's quite similar. So the only thing we've added, it looks complicated, but all we've added is this. And it doesn't even have to be that long. I could have made it the same as the one above if I wanted to make this simpler. So I could have just made it there we go. So hopefully that's then easier to see. Now with wget, you have to use an equal sign between these options, whereas in curl you don't. But that's really, apart from the fact that the words are different for the options, that's pretty much the only difference. So you can see that curl and wget will both allow us to connect to FTP servers almost exactly how we connect to a HTTP server. And hopefully the confusion and the fog of those two things has disappeared. They're just two different protocols for connecting to files. And as far as curl and wget are concerned, that's all they are, and you can use them similarly. Now, there's an awful lot more to cover, but we'll leave it here for now, as this is an essentials video, as I've mentioned. One thing I do suggest you look into, though, is the FTP utility itself, which will allow you to establish an interactive environment to explore an FTP server, which is very useful if you don't want to use a graphical interface like FileZilla and you want to go into an FTP server and just see what's there first. That's a great way of doing it, so check out the FTP utility. Okay, so that's it. As a quick review, you now know how to use curl and wget to retrieve files both over HTTP and FTP using a variety of options depending on the server you're connected to. And I also showed you how to retrieve data from an API via curl, which is a very useful thing to know how to do. You've seen just how similar the syntax is for FTP and HTTP, and how at the command line, in a matter of less than a minute, you can download any publicly available file. The only thing you really need to do is to know that those files are there in the first place and how to get them. Now you can go and get them. Okay, I hope you found this brief tour of curl and wget useful. If you did, please do like and subscribe. It's incredibly useful for me. I put a lot of effort in, and if you like and subscribe, it really helps. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.